this. Yeah.
Yay! Thank you.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Campylobacter sequencing in Minnesota. So a little bit different than, I think for the most part, we've been talking about Listeria, Salmonella, maybe a little bit S-Tech. But we have been sequencing our Campylobacter isolates in Minnesota since about May. And the reason we're doing this is a special project, EIP funding, part of a FoodNet project. So otherwise, I don't know if we'd actually be sequencing any Campylobacter. And it's important to note that we're not doing it in real time. It's more batching, filling runs. So kind of the cluster detection piece is certainly delayed, even more than just with other sequencing clusters. And for a cluster definition, right now we're using 10 SNPs, anything within 10 SNPs, and we don't have a time period. And we've very quickly realized this is way too broad, and we're going to be changing this at the end of the year. We want to kind of 1 year to get some data and make a kind of educated decision about this, which we're going to do, kind of sit down with our lab and discuss, what's the appropriate time period and what's kind of the right number of SNPs to call it cluster. So far we've had 66 Campylobacter whole genome sequencing clusters investigated. And I know that's kind of a large number, but the vast majority of these have been like 2 cases each in the cluster. So for most of these investigations, it's looking at 2 case interviews rather quickly, not finding anything in common, and then kind of waiting for additional cases and stopping there. In terms of communication between the Epi and lab, we're kind of a big proponent. What's been working for us for Salmonella and for other pathogens is keeping things in terms of who does what and how we notify, similar to how we've been doing it historically with PFG. So our lab is the ones who identify the clusters, and then they'll send an email notification to the EPIs. There's an example on this slide. And then the EPIs investigate the cluster, and we report the outcome kind of during weekly meetings that include lab staff. And I think that's important to kind of have that feedback to the lab so they know kind of the outcome of their work. I know they appreciate that. So what have we found? So we had 2 clinical Campylobacter jejuni isolates that were 3 SNPs apart. And the first case was a Minnesota case, and when they were interviewed, they reported buying and eating chicken livers from a grocery store. The second case was actually a Wisconsin resident whose isolate had come to the Minnesota lab. And when Wisconsin followed up with the case, they also reported eating the same brand of chicken livers as the Minnesota case. So these golden plump chicken livers, there's a picture of them on the slide. And we think this is an outbreak and certainly one that we identified with sequencing, wouldn't have identified otherwise. And then kind of just late last week, we have a new sequencing cluster that appears to be due to rescue puppies. And it's not like the same rescue the puppies are coming from. It's actually different rescues, but when we talk to the rescues, they're getting puppies from the same reservation in South Dakota. So we think there's a common connection there. So kind of during this time period that we've been sequencing our Campylobacter isolates, we've also had several other restaurant outbreaks. So this first outbreak, we had 3 Campy jejuni cases, one of which was not confirmed at our lab, so we didn't have any sequencing results on it. But all 3 reported eating chicken liver pate at the same restaurant. And their meal dates were about 3 days apart. And when we did sequence the 2 isolates that we had, they were 11,691 different. So not closely related at all by sequencing. And just kind of funny aside, apparently this restaurant's well known for this dish. So well known, in fact, that the recipe was in Food and Wine, which is shown on the slide there. So a little bit later, we had a second restaurant outbreak, and this was 2 Campy jejuni cases. And when interviewed, they reported eating chicken wings at the same restaurant. And their meal dates were 11 days apart. The environmental health assessment also identified some food handling issues as well. But when we sequenced the 2 isolates, they were 11,706 SNPs apart. So again, very far apart in terms of sequencing. And so clearly we're seeing that kind of not line up directly with EPI, and I'll comment on that on kind of the next slide. So in general, we're seeing that Campylobacter sequencing can be useful to identify outbreaks. We would not have identified that grocery store chicken liver outbreak without sequencing. Probably wouldn't have investigated well enough to identify the commonality with those rescue puppies without the sequencing information. But we are seeing Campylobacter isolates associated with the same outbreak not be closely related by sequencing as well. And so we theorize it's probably likely due to the fact that chicken is commonly contaminated with Campylobacter. And these particular outbreaks were, issues with food handling or preparation. And so we're seeing kind of Campylobacter in people, it's whatever strain is on that particular piece of chicken, which may not be the same, kind of a couple days down the line, that might be a completely different type of Campylobacter on that piece of chicken that they're doing the food handling error on. So I would say kind of our conclusion so far is we definitely think it's of less utility sequencing Campylobacter than other pathogens like Salmonella, S-tech, Listeria. But we did find additional outbreaks that we wouldn't have found otherwise. And in addition to these outbreaks, we've had a number of clusters with kind of a general common exposure. So, a couple of cases that both have live poultry contact or both have recently purchased puppies, but no obvious connection. It's not the same breeder for the puppies. It's not the same hatchery for the live poultry exposures. So we think maybe that indicates sequencing will have some utility for Campylobacter attribution. So kind of this is our quick look at where we're at right now. Kind of when we get to the end of the year, I know we're planning to look kind of more closely at what's an appropriate cut point and how we should kind of move forward with sequencing Campylobacter. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Josh. I think it's best if we hold questions until the end, just because some of our talks may have overlapping themes or this or that. But again, if you want to ask Josh something specifically, either jot it down or feel free to use the chat. And then we will transition. Next will be Madhu Anand from here, the New York COE.
So can you guys see my presentation slides, or can you see my note slides?
We see your presentation slides.
Okay. So I'll go back to the beginning because I just realized I'm at the end. So I am going to talk a little bit about S-tech and E. coli. On one of the previous live learning sessions, I talked a little bit about how we define clusters and prioritize within New York State. So I'm just putting that workflow up again, but I really want to hone in on that. The analysis so far is being done in-house. We anticipate that switching over to bionumerics once it's up and running. But we really look at any 2 or more S-tech isolates within 20 SNPs in a year. Just like Minnesota, we are discussing whether the SNP cutoff and the year cutoff is really meeting our purposes right now, and we are pulling together some data to reevaluate that. And actually, we just had our monthly Lab Epi data meeting over at Wadsworth this morning, and we're still taking a look at it and had a pretty robust discussion about this. But with that in mind, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how we actually got a report of a new cluster relatively recently and just how that all unfolded. So our lab conducted routine whole genome sequencing. They detected 3 E. coli 0157 isolates that were 0 to 1 SNPs away from each other, and that they all had different PFG patterns and weren't previously reported to us because of PFG, because they had differing PFGE patterns. And so I think, even though we're not using allele codes right now, this is the way they shared the information still could have been shared in a similar way with allele codes. So what was particularly interesting was that all of these isolates were collected from County A in a several-month period in 2018, so they were likely to be related. And so we definitely wanted to look into that further. However, Wadsworth was able to give us some additional information. They noticed that these 3 isolates were away from a cluster of 4 isolates reported in May of 2016 from counties A, B, and C. So counties A, B, and C are all pretty much bordering each other in the western portion of our state. So those 4 cases back in 2016 all had the same PFGE pattern at the time and were investigated as a cluster. The PFGE pattern that was identified in 2016 was one of the ones that was identified now in 2018 with these 3 new isolates. So back in 2016, we had looked at whether or not, at the exposure histories, and we only had 2 of 4 cases that had a completed exposure history. At that time, we requested whole genome sequencing because we really weren't sure how hard to push for additional information. If there were additional cases, we just weren't sure how hard to push on these cases. And at the time, whole genome sequencing revealed that they were related and they were 0 to 1 SNPs apart. So Wadsworth then shared the complete picture with us. So because these counties are all bordering each other and that they were within 20 SNPs of each other, they believe that the 3 new isolates were related to the 2016 isolates. And then they also came across another isolate that was in the same geographic area and within that 20 SNP limit back from 2017, also in County A. And so we right now are looking at a cluster of 8 cases. So one of the challenges we've had is, all right, well, this is clearly a cluster. It's not part of a national cluster, but how do we track this information? And so in-house, we've developed a methodology to name clusters. So for E. coli, we use EC. If it's for Salmonella, I believe we use the serotype. So ST for Salmonella typhimurium or SE for Salmonella enteritidis. And then the year the cluster was identified, the month the cluster was identified, and the number within the month and year it was identified. So this is the first cluster that was identified in May 2016 of E. coli. So in addition, Wadsworth did provide us some supporting documents. They did provide us a SNP tree of the entire cluster, as well as the original whole genome sequencing summary from 2016, and a SNP matrix of the cluster, as well as just a table of all the isolates. So I just want to show you what those documents looked like. So I know this tree looks really bizarre. I did have to block out our PN USA numbers as well as our in-house accession numbers. Again, that's another example of Lab and Epi communicating with each other. Because this presentation is being recorded and will be available publicly, there is just some concern about those numbers getting out to the public, so that's why I have them blacked out here. But I think you can still see the general aspects that we want to talk about. So these are the 2018 cases up at the top. They're within 0 to 1 SNP. We also have some of the 2016 cases that are down here that are 0 to 1 SNP. And then we have another 2016 case at the top and the 2017 case in the middle. So in entirety, this is spanning 0 to 16 SNPs. And then this is just the SNP matrix. kind of gives you the same picture. Again, not so helpful without the isolate IDs, but just to give you an example of how it's communicated. So as far as the investigation goes, our recent 2018 cases had the National Hypothesis Generating Questionnaire completed, as that is our initial questionnaire, but that did not happen until this past year. So the 2016 cases had a much more abbreviated interview. So because of the limited exposure history on the older cases, it was hard to identify a common product. We did get shopper card histories on a subset of the recent cases. We did generate some hypotheses. So for instance, it looked like there potentially on some of the cases there was the olive bar at a popular grocery store in the area, as well as I think avocados. But when you looked at the onset dates of those cases, the onset dates were several months apart, even though they were still within 2018. So I think logistically, we put them, an olive bar would be restocked many times in the time frame we were looking at. So ultimately, it's unsolved at this point in time, but it is still an ongoing cluster. We still would prioritize it at this point because of just, I think there's a lot of different things going on between the geographic clustering. Even though it's spanning 2 years, we do find that it's interesting that there are multiple PSGE patterns that have been identified and that are clustering together as well. And so I'm going to hold for questions to the end and wrap up. And let me stop sharing. There we go. All right.